Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of February 12th, 2026. We are coming to you again this week from the semi-quincentennial division here at the Georgia Historical Society. In our ongoing commemoration of the US 250, my special guest today is author and historian Richard Bell, who joins us today to talk about his new book about the American Revolution as a global conflict. Richard Bell is professor of history at the University of Maryland. He was born in England and received his BA from the University of Cambridge and his master's and PhD from Harvard University. Rick was an Andrew Carnegie Fellow from 2021 to 2023, and he's held research fellowships at more than 24 libraries and institutes. He has served as the Mellon Fellow in American History at Cambridge University, the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at the American Antiquarian Society, a Mayer Fellow at the Huntington Library, a Research Fellow at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Abolition, and Resistance at Yale University, and as a Resident Fellow at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. He is also a frequent lecturer on C-SPAN TV network and at the Smithsonian Institution. Rick is the recipient of more than a dozen teaching awards, including the University System of Maryland Board of Regents Faculty Award for Excellence in Teaching, the highest honor for teaching faculty in the Maryland state system. In addition to his publications, Rick is also a teacher in the online and very popular Great Courses series. He teaches a class entitled America's Long Struggle Against Slavery, which examines the black freedom struggle in America from the 15th century to Reconstruction. I have listened to it all, and it is fantastic. He also teaches a course entitled Ordinary Americans in the American Revolution. He is the author of 4 books. The first is entitled Buried Lives, Incarcerated in Early America, published by the University of Georgia Press in 2012, co-edited with Michelle Lease Tarter. A book entitled We Shall Be No More, Suicide and Self-Government in the Newly United States, published by Harvard University Press in 2012, nominated for the Organization of American Historians Frederick Jackson Turner Award, the American Studies Association's John Hope Franklin Publication Prize, and the American Society for Legal History's Cromwell Book Prize. A book entitled Stolen, 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home, published by Simon & Schuster in 2019, a finalist for the George Washington Prize and the Harriet Tubman Prize. And finally, the one he is here to talk with me about today, entitled The American Revolution and the Fate of the World, published by Penguin Riverhead on November 4th, 2025. My conversation with Rick Bell begins now. Rick Bell, welcome to our podcast.
I'm delighted to be here.
I am going to start at the beginning, and your beginning, and I want to talk to you about your teachers who influenced you. But before we do that, you note in your book that you grew up outside London. And so I have to ask a question I'm sure you've answered many, many times, which is, how did you first become interested in not only the American Revolution, but American history in general, to the point that you would want to come over and get your PhD at Harvard?
It's certainly an unexpected turn of events. You know, growing up as a kid outside London, I never imagined that this would be the course my life would take, devoted to American history for the last 25 years. It happened by, I guess, serendipity. I was in college in the UK. I went to Cambridge and I studied medieval European history because that's what I'd been taught in school, where we'd not laid a finger on American history in K-12. We'd instead studied Europe and Britain, Britain and Europe, Europe and Britain over and over again. So I went to college to do more of the same, European history. And I eventually, ran out of college courses on medieval European history, especially given my complete lack of language ability, meant that I couldn't take some advanced courses in, say, medieval French or Old Norse or something like that. So I was stumbling around, Stan, for a few extra courses and course credits in order to graduate. And I think that's how I stumbled into a class on colonial and revolutionary American history taught by Professor Betty Wood, who was one of, I think, only three Americanists out of 70 historians at Cambridge. That tells you what a lack of focus American history has in the UK
Mm.
and in Europe. But thank God I found her. She was amazing. She's one of the best teachers I've ever had. If she'd been teaching about Russian history, maybe I'd be telling you about why Russian history is awesome today. Good teachers make a big difference.
Hmm.
So I was hooked on colonial and revolutionary history in college by Betty Wood and made a big decision to double down on that, to pivot away from European history, to try to get a PhD in American history and to go to America to do it, which seemed like a pretty sensible decision once you've decided to focus on American history. I was very fortunate to get accepted into the PhD program at Harvard. I thought they'd made a mistake when they sent me the letter, and got to spend 6 or 7 very happy years studying with another amazing crew of historians led by Laurel Ulrich and Jill Lepore and Joyce Chaplin at Harvard. I met my Missouri wife in graduate school. So, for someone born in North London, I have visited central Missouri way more than most other Londoners will ever dare to dream. So, it's been quite the change.
Well, I was going to ask you about the trio you mentioned at Harvard because I know that you worked under them for your PhD. You dedicate the book to three individuals, one of whom is Betty Wood, who, of course, was not only a great historian of American history, but she focused on, in particular, Georgia history,
Yes, she did.
slavery. I met Betty, had the pleasure of meeting her when I first got to the Historical Society here over 25 years ago. You dedicate the book to David Hopper, Betty Wood, and Laurel Ulrich. The last two, of course, familiar. You've already mentioned them. Tell me about these teachers, their influence on you as a historian, as a scholar.
Yeah, I'm so glad you made that Georgia connection, Stan. The community of scholars who work on early Georgia is pretty small, pretty cohesive, but extraordinary, talented and
Hmm.
focused and using the
Hmm.
great resources you guys have. And Betty Wood, I think, was in some ways, for a time, the sort of dean of historians of early Georgia. She passed away a few years ago, sadly.
Hmm.
So I had a lot of exposure to the early social history of Georgia and adjacent colonies in the South through Betty Wood's instruction, and I loved it. So Laura Ulrich is the second person that I dedicate my book to. She was my PhD advisor. Some people may recognize that name from bumper stickers that are on the backs of cars all across America. If you've ever seen the bumper sticker, "Well-behaved women seldom make history," that's Laurel Thatcher Ulrich from Harvard University. She coined a bumper sticker. How many history professors get to do that? And she was and is one of the most talented historians in American history. I was incredibly fortunate to work with her. And then the first person I dedicate my book to, David Hopper. He was my history teacher in, I think, 10th and 11th and 12th grade back in the UK. And even though he sadly did not introduce me to American history, we did a lot of Britain and Europe, as I mentioned early on. It was he who got me interested in history as a discipline. It was he that made me see that history is not just memorizing names and dates, which is the way I had been taught prior to maybe 10th grade. I'd had the gym teacher as my history teacher, which is not always the best sign. And I think his talents lay in the gymnasium rather than in the history classroom. So when we got David Hopper as our 10th grade history teacher, it was like going from night to day, right? He had a completely different understanding of what history is. He understood history is about understanding the past. It's about meeting people in the past on their own terms and trying to make what you can of their choices. He understands it's about why things happen. It's about empathy. It's about critical thinking. It's about source analysis. That it's really interesting and really hard and really fruitful. And he also had a style of teaching that made it very clear he was emotionally invested in his students' performance as well, right? And I, for whatever reason, maybe that's because I come from a Catholic family originally, I responded to the guilt. David turned me on to history, and then Betty and Laurel made American history my life's work.
Um, as I told our audience before we began talking, one of the things that you've done is record a fantastic course with the great courses entitled America's Long Struggle Against Slavery. You clearly, and what strikes me, Rick, about your career is even though you are a fully credentialed academic historian, you seem to have dedicated your scholarship and your career and really your life to being a public historian, to reaching a broad audience and explaining all of these subjects that you cover. Is that fair?
It's kind of you to say it, to put it in those terms. I would say yes, that I'm very interested in talking about history in public to as many people who will listen or read what I've written or what I'm writing as possible. And I do think we need that at this moment in American history. And I do think, and I hope I don't sound like I'm standing on a pulpit here, that professional historians can't cede the ground of public history to cable news hosts, right? That professional historians who know what they're talking about need to be in that conversation as much as possible. So I started doing public-facing talks back before COVID. There's a wonderful organization in the Washington, D.C. area, founded there, called Profs and Pints. And it's exactly what it sounds like, Stan.
I love it.
It sends professors into bars and tells them, hey, go give a talk over there to those people. And so I've been doing that for almost 10 years now. And the platform has taken off. It's in many cities now, including some not too far from you guys. And I love that chance to talk about interesting, complicated, significant things in public, and then see what comments and questions people have. It's an extension of my undergraduate teaching, of course. And then you've seen another version of that in the Great Courses Plus, which is this online video streaming platform that many people may have heard of. Think of it as like Netflix for nerds. And I've recorded three courses actually for them. I've recorded this course about the anti-slavery fight that I'm very proud of that you mentioned. I think it's like 24 lectures or something like that.
Hmm.
I recorded another one about ordinary lives in the American Revolution, a sort of ground up social history of the American Revolution. And then dropping this May of 2026, there'll be a brand new course, 12 parts, or a deep dive into the Declaration of Independence, timed
Oh,
for, of
excellent.
course, the America 250, July 2026. So I
Mm.
hope people will take a look at that one. Super proud of that one. It should be a barn burner.
And so well done. You accompanied through many runs, weight workouts, yard work. I listened to the audio, and I should say you're not confined. Obviously, you can get this through Audible to plug this. These things are not confined to video. They're wonderful to watch there too, of course. And I applaud you for all of that. The Profs and Pints. I have got to find a chapter here locally. Sounds wonderful. Um, so. One, I should also mention, by the way, you're one of the few historians who narrates their own book because of this wonderful voice that you have. I checked it out, and you narrate the book that we're talking about today, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. Did they approach you, or did you approach them? And did you say, "Hey, I would love to do this. Read my own work."
So it's a bit embarrassing actually, because the last public-facing book I did about 5 years ago for a different publisher called Simon and Schuster, and the
Hmm.
book is called "Stolen: Five Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home," a harrowing true tale of enslavement and freedom seeking. They hired an actor to be the narrator for that previous book, which was the right choice for that book. But between that book and this new book coming out now, I'd done more and more public speaking, and it's the voice can be a tool and an instrument and something you practice and try to get better at. And my ego told me maybe for this new book, maybe I could be the audiobook reader for this one, but I got to be clear, they didn't suggest it. I had to beg them. I had to beg Penguin Random House to let me be the narrator, and I hope my enthusiasm for the subject comes through on the audiobook for the new book, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. And I hope no one here in the US is turned off by hearing a British voice in their ear telling them about the American Revolution. I need to remind folks on occasions like this that despite this silly accent, I'm also a naturalized US citizen and definitely not a sleeper agent for King George.
Well, no, it was just the opposite, Rick. I think your voice draws people in. I think it is just it's so well done, so engaging, and I was delighted to see because there aren't many academic historians or as historians at all who are asked to do that. And I know you said you had to beg them, but I think that will pay off. It is a delight to listen to you read your own work. There's something about that I think that makes it even better as an experience. So let's dive into this new book. I've been reading about the American Revolution really my whole life, and certainly my entire professional life for 30 years. And you taught me things that I just simply didn't know. I mean, I can't recommend this book enough to people who think they know the subject. We've long understood that the American Revolution was in many ways a global conflict. I thought I had understood that, but you open doors and let us look into people and places in their lives in a way that I don't know that any other author has done. And we're going to go through some of this and some of the ways that you've done it. How many years did it take you to write this book between the research and the writing and your teaching and all the other things, being a father, all the other things that you do? How much time did you have to devote to this?
Yeah, we're all busy, right? So this book took me about, I think, 5 years, which by my standards is quick. My previous book, which has a very different sort of thread to it, took about 10 years. So this one came out quick, and that's because this book is a synthesis.
Mm.
I started writing and researching during COVID, for instance, when we were all locked down. So that means, of course, I did not get to go to Peru or Prussia or Pondicherry or any of the places that begin with P, for instance, that I talk about in the book. Instead, I am pulling together discrete existing scholarship by experts working in a series of narrow, siloed academic fields and wrapping my arms around them and trying to synthesize the state of the field and put 14, 15 different literatures, geographies, groups of historians' writings together and say something that's new and original, that's bigger than the sum of its parts. So, what that means is, even though that's an incredibly difficult writing and intellectual challenge, it means if I have access to a great research library, which for me is the University of Maryland's McKeldin Library, then I can do a lot with what's on the shelf and with the power of interlibrary loan, right? Because I'm reading generations of historians' detailed scholarship, passing through their evidence and selecting how I want to use that evidence and build on their claims. So, this book couldn't be executed by one human being going to every country in the world and every archive in the world. That's simply impossible. The only way to write a global history of the American Revolution is to synthesize, which is what I've done here. And so that means that the timetable is a bit more accelerated. I might spend 3 or 4 months gathering all the research for one chapter, let's say the Spanish Alliance in the American Revolution, reading it carefully, digesting it, figuring out my own position in regards to that pre-existing scholarship, and then trying to draft a 20-page chapter that really takes readers who've never read about the Spanish Alliance before into that vibrant conversation. So that was the writing challenge here, how to translate separate silos of historical research by other gifted historians into something that's accessible for the general public.
Now, do you do all of your research and reading at one time and then write, or do you write as you go along?
I mean, I think all of us who do this sort of work hope that we can compartmentalize research and then writing, that we can gather our materials, analyze them, and then set to work and never look back. In practice, writing history is really messy, like anything. And so the more you write, the more you realize what holes there are in the research you've already done, and then you have to scurry back and find ways to get up to speed and plug whatever holes you have. So I was constantly going back at short notice to my research library, begging the ILL, the Interlibrary Loan Team, to send me stuff tomorrow. I need it tomorrow. Where is it? I need it tomorrow. So I hope I thanked them in the acknowledgments because they were absolutely clutch.
How did you decide what to include and what to leave out? Did you start out with a broad outline of what you wanted to do, or did you go along and go, should do a chapter on India. I should do a chapter on Botany Bay. These are not places, by the way, that generally, if you're reading about the American Revolution, you expect to be reading about. Did you sort of map it all out before you started in the way that Shelby Foote outlined everything, or did you? I don't mean to make it up as you went along, but you understand sort of the joy of discovery, so to speak. That maybe the next chapter is going to go this way.
Yeah, I think there's more to the joy of discovery approach that resonates with me. I certainly outline and plan, but then I also am open to discovery and serendipity, right? So, I knew that if I'm going to tackle a global history of the American Revolution, that some places and people are obviously going to make an appearance, right? Think of the French, think of the Spanish, for
Mm-hmm.
instance. But it was a voyage of discovery to read enough to find out that actually the settlement of Australia in 1788 is deeply tied to the loss of the American colonies just a few years earlier, and that
Mm-hmm.
story, which is the most globally sweeping, of course, in the chapter, the US and Australia could not be physically further apart, is an essential building block of, making the claim to readers that this is a truly global war. Um, uh, I was hesitant to write a chapter about India unless I could prove that Americans in the Revolution knew all about India and what was happening there, and that people in India knew all about what was happening in America and that they were on the same page. And once I proved that to my satisfaction, I knew that the India chapter was necessary and urgent. But yes, I have been, reading myself into literatures that I was only dimly aware of before I started this project 5 years ago. I think, one way to select book projects is to give yourself the opportunity to learn stuff you didn't know before, right? To educate yourself. And that was certainly true for this book project, right? I learned a ton in the course of sharing what I know with everyone else. I learned that the existing literatures on different corners of this are way broader and deeper than I ever imagined, and I've got some joy now in sharing that literature with general readers who buy this one book, which goes in 14 different directions.
It really does. And before we dive down, as you mentioned, of course, there's a chapter here on the French alliance, on the Spanish Empire, and the role that it played. But one of the things that struck me most, that really stood out, that I guess I just didn't really. We know that the loyalists, many of them left what became the United States. But really, what struck me is this was a massively disruptive global event that dislodged populations and many different populations. Let's begin by talking about that. And maybe that's beginning at the end, and we shouldn't do that. But that's what really the big news that came out of this. One of these things is that this was a massively disruptive. In fact, I think you used the term at some point, and I don't want to misquote you here. I'll let you tell it. But it was. This is really one of the first refugee crises globally. This
That's right.
event,
Yeah,
the
it's the
American,
first modern
which is
refugee crisis.
yeah,
That's right.
which is astonishing when you think about it. Talk about that a little bit.
It is, yeah. So, the way this book is set up, 14 different chapters about 14 different things. This is a sort of choose your own adventure book, right? You can read the chapters almost in any order you want, but certain
Hmm.
themes, I think, would recur. And one of those themes is migration and mobility.
Hmm.
There's a lot of people being moved around, often involuntarily, by the disruptions of this global war, and that the war is a catastrophe for many of the people who swept up in its tides. And you put those two themes together, migration and catastrophe, and you get refugees, I think. And so there are all sorts of refugees created by this global war. Some of the most prominent types of refugees would be natives who are dispossessed of their lands and settlements by this war, black freedom seekers who escape slavery and end up behind British lines seeking asylum in what remains of the British Empire after the war, and American loyalists who seek to leave revolutionary America to escape violence and intimidation and to preserve their ties to the British Empire, who end up in other parts of Britain's global war as well. Um, those white loyalists end up in many different places. Some go to London, not nearly as many as we might think, only about 8,000. We think about 30 or 40,000 go to British Canada, especially Nova Scotia. seeing that as a close alternative to what they left behind in Massachusetts or somewhere like that. Some
Hmm.
other American loyalists will end up in British Jamaica. And I actually use one family to sort of stand in for the general experiences of these 60,000 American loyalists who leave revolutionary America by war's end. And I use a woman named Peggy Shippen. Her name may not be super familiar to all of your listeners until I tell you who she got married to, which was Benedict Arnold.
Hmm.
This woman from a loyalist leaning family in Philadelphia marries a famous patriot general in Philadelphia during the war, and many scholars think that she's the one who proposes treachery to him. That's hard to prove, of course, but certainly she's very sympathetic to the idea that her patriot husband becomes a loyalist, effectively, like her own family, and that will cost. And then when the Arnolds botch their defection, they really mess it up. They will become refugees, part of this 60,000 loyalist diaspora trying to get the hell out of revolutionary America. And for the Arnolds, of course, it's basically because there's a death warrant on Benedict's shoulders. So they go to London. They are not welcomed in London because, as far as British people are concerned, these are just a bunch of Americans who've come over. And all these American accented loyalist refugees sound to the British public like the American patriots. British people can't really tell the difference, right? And so they're not welcomed in London. They try their luck as private citizens in New Brunswick, in British Canada. They are not welcomed by British Canadians because it turns out British Canadians don't like traitors any more than Londoners or Americans like traitors. Turns out no one likes a traitor, Stan.
Hmm.
And then they go back to London where they continue to face harassment. And after Benedict dies, Peggy Shippen Arnold tries to get their children, the Arnold children, into jobs in the British Army in British India, of course, where hopefully having the last name Arnold won't stop their rise. So watch them being buffeted around the rest of the British Empire after war's end. And I think that buffeting stands in for the migration and mobility experiences of tens of thousands of white American loyalist refugees after the war.
And the Arnold story really is a tragic one for people who have never really followed exactly what happened to them. Benedict Arnold died in 1804 at the age of 60. I think it was 1804, and even his grave was eventually lost. And she died in almost poverty. And it's as you say, they stand in. You can just imagine that story is repeated thousands of times. They're really not. They can never find a home. They're never welcome anywhere. They're restless, and they can't ever really get started again. I mean, it was really a high price to pay, I think. And some would argue, of course, Arnold brought that on himself, but nevertheless, it's heartrending.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would say both those things at the same time, right? Arnold brought that on himself, and it is nonetheless heartrending. That's right.
Hmm. So, and of course, you have a chapter on Molly Brandt. You talk about the indigenous population. There were 150,000 indigenous people east of the Mississippi, and there is no other way around it, I think, than other than to say their story is tragic too. They got essentially a very raw deal from the American Revolution.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so, native people are central actors in the American Revolutionary drama. We should never forget that. So I was very keen in this global history to make sure that natives were one of these important demographic groups that are no longer invisible to us. And Ken Burns got a lot of flack for incorporating native history into his recent PBS documentary. I think that's unfair because every scholar worth their salt will tell you how essential and central native actors actually were. Ken Burns got it right on that particular front, and I'm inspired by generations of great scholarship on native
Hmm.
history and the Revolution by native scholars like Ned Blackhawk and Phil Deloria, and non-native scholars like Kathleen Duval at UNC, one of the greatest historians working today. And I've learned loads from their work. And I think we all agree that natives, many of them choose not to sit on their hands during the American Revolution. They see the stakes as too high. Many native groups make a formal alliance with one side or the other, and most of them, about 4 to 1, break for the British side, right? They do that because they perceive Western colonists as pushing on to native land. They see those Western colonists as wishing King George would stop meddling in their westward expansion. They see King George, therefore, as an alternative to patriot-led westward expansion. So they ally with King George, hoping that when George wins the war, he will stop the flow of white settlement across the Appalachians. And of course, they guess wrong because King George loses the war, and then Britain will eventually evacuate its forts in the west, leaving Britain's former native allies high and dry and vulnerable to US Army attacks after the war, and also subject to a peace treaty signed between Britain and the US, which ceded most native land west of the Appalachians to the US, which is appalling given that natives had no role in that peace treaty, in that cession of land. So I agree with you, Stan, that the consequences of the American Revolution are a period of crisis and catastrophe for native people west of the Appalachians.
And I think to your point about Ken Burns, it speaks to the fact that the American population in general, or consumers of this kind of entertainment slash information, with Ken Burns, it went against the flow of the narrative that they think they know, right? That's so ingrained that we've been taught, we've been told the traditional narratives leave out the indigenous population. So suddenly to include them, and you make, of course, an excellent case in your chapter. It's overwhelming evidence that they were involved at every level and every place on the frontier, up and down the coast, and it's absolutely part of the story. And I think that's the point of your book in general, that all of these places that seem so remote, or you think to yourself, why in the hell am I going to read about Latin America right now? And then you make the case, and it's absolutely irrefutable. So that's a long way of saying I think part of the reason he caught flack is because it goes against the narrative grain that we've all been taught. But
Yeah,
that
we've
doesn't mean it's not true.
That's right. I think, I've lived in this country for 20 years. I love being American. I'm very proud of that. But, in pop culture, in the national conversations we're allowed to have about the American Revolution in public, we've stripped it down to a very narrow and simplistic rebels versus redcoats script, David
Hmm.
versus Goliath, an old song, right? And
Right.
historians, will tell you till they're blue in the face. It's much more complicated and much more interesting than that. And the point I
Hmm.
would make at this point in the conversation, Stan, is that patriots were well aware that this was a global struggle with global actors, and they wanted it to be a global struggle with global actors. Patriot leaders like George Washington, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, you name your favorite founding father, they all worked tirelessly to expand what began as a domestic dispute within the British Empire into a worldwide blaze. And as a piece of military or diplomatic strategy, folks like Washington and Franklin knew the only way to win was to have the British Army spread as thin as possible, fighting as many different enemies in as many different places. Ditto for the Royal Navy as well. So that's why, Franklin goes up to Canada in 1776 to try to get French Canadians to rise up. It's why he creates a German language handbill to try to persuade Hessian soldiers to desert King George's ranks. It's why they sent him to Paris for 90 months to try to secure military alliances with France and Spain and the Netherlands. It is patriot strategy to make this a global multi-actor war. So all we're doing is recovering and honoring patriot strategy, which was successful, by the way. The Patriots win because of this strategy.
Hmm. So we mentioned loyalists and we mentioned natives, and you alluded to Black freedom seekers. You have a chapter on a fellow named Harry Washington. Is it fair to say who was enslaved? Is it fair to say that most enslaved people saw the revolution in much the same way that enslaved people saw the Civil War, an opportunity for them to vote with their feet, vote for freedom, and that they saw the British as the entity more likely to lead to freedom? And were they right in that?
Yeah, I think that comparison is very useful because I think it is now, thankfully, becoming a commonly held understanding that during the Civil War, enslaved people used the chaos of that war to free themselves in large numbers and to force asylum status, refugee status from the U.S. Army, really pushing Lincoln's hand towards the Emancipation Proclamation. And I would say the same sequence of events, the same African-centered decision-making narrative works pretty well for the American Revolution as well. We see enslaved people seeing the British Empire go to war against itself, seeing white Americans go to war against each other, loyalists versus patriots in the war, and say, oh, this is an opportunity. How can I use this? How can I leverage this chaos to advance my agenda, which is to free myself from this awful experience of human bondage? And so many enslaved people run towards British lines once British commanders start considering the prospect of freedom proclamations as a way to screw with patriot enslavers. And so there's a guy called Harry. That's not his birth name. It's the name he's given by his enslavers, who was enslaved by George Washington at Mount Vernon. He's a stable master at George Washington's Mount Vernon. He's in Virginia. He gets wind that a British commander in Virginia named Lord Dunmore is promising lifelong freedom to any enslaved man brave enough to desert his patriot enslaver and come and join the British. And that's all the news Harry needs to take to his heels, as you said, Stan, and go to join the British ranks for much of the war. And I narrate his wartime experience, and then I narrate the bargain he and other black refugees demand from British commanders in New York at the end of the war to take them out of revolutionary America and to relocate them somewhere better, somewhere freer, which for Harry is going to be British Canada at first, and ultimately Sierra Leone in West Africa. This is an amazing globe-trotting story, and I don't know why there's not a movie about Harry Washington, because even though he may be new to some of your listeners here, and I hope to readers of the book, scholars have been telling each other stories about Harry Washington for 20 years now. Someone needs to really buy those film rights and do a good job.
Yeah, and his story is tragic too. I mean, it just is, right? I mean, he represents again, I think, broken promises, this sense that people just kept striving for something, a better life, more freedom, and kept being let down at
Yeah,
every
those are
step.
British broken promises, to be
Yeah.
clear, right? I'm not trying to argue that Britain is the noble freedom fighter here. Britain does not have an anti-slavery policy in place. It's just a strategic effort to screw with their patriot enemies that they promise these sorts of proclamations.
Hmm.
And then Britain will make all sorts of big promises to black freedom fighters in return for their assistance, and then will really struggle to honor those promises. Yeah, war is hell, and the American Revolution is no exception.
Yeah, and they did live. I mean, they tried in some levels. Individuals and maybe even governments and entities tried to live up to some of this, the promises made. But the farther you get, it seemed, from the end of the revolution and the war, the less they were dedicated to that.
That's right.
One of the other spotlights that you sign on things that you hear about sort of obliquely without really knowing a lot about is POWs on prison ships, and you tell the story of William Russell. Talk about those and the role they played in this conflict.
I really love researching and writing this chapter because I knew almost nothing about this before I decided, yep, we're going to do this. This one's a go.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to talk about two subjects in 20 pages there. The first subject is privateers. Privateers, as many of your listeners will know, are basically state licensed pirates in wartime. And because the US does not have a functioning navy in the American Revolution, the Continental Navy is basically an idea on the back of a napkin at this point. It is massively outgunned at sea by the world's largest and most powerful navy, the Royal Navy. So the best the Continental Congress can do on short notice is authorize privateers to give letters of marque, as they're called, or licenses to merchant ships to fill their merchant ships with guns and go out and start shooting at British merchant ships on the high seas to either sink them or confiscate their cargo or to take the fight into British waters in some degree or other. And privateering ends up being a major initiative of the Continental Congress and the individual states. I think one of the numbers I give is that 50,000 Americans are involved as privateers. Bear in mind the Continental Army at the time was as few as 5,000 people. So this is a lot of people.
Hmm.
And they inflict extraordinary damage on British merchant shipping. And that not only has an economic cost, but it sends a political message to Britain about the costs of continuing this war. And Britain responds, of course, by trying to capture every privateer it possibly can to take them off the Atlantic battlefield. And this is when William Russell, the privateer I'm following in this chapter, gets captured. He will actually be captured twice because he keeps at it. And he is incarcerated first in a detention site on Britain's south coast. Imagine a sort of Guantanamo Bay sort of black site. And then when he's eventually traded from that and becomes a privateer again, he'll be captured a second time. And this time he will be sent to the worst black hole anywhere in the British Empire. And that is the Jersey, which is a ship, a demasted zombie cargo ship that's been turned into a floating prison, floating in Brooklyn Bay. And it is the most lethal place anywhere on God's earth in the American Revolution, has an annual mortality rate of 50%, much more dangerous than any battlefield you care to go on. And I narrate what happens to William Russell when he gets to the Jersey. So we're thinking about privateers, but also about POWs and about the essential maritime dimensions of this global war. And, one of the central points carried throughout the book, not just in this chapter, but in others, Stan, is that, sea power was, of course, an important key to military success in this great age of sail, and that what happened at sea was often just as important as whatever has happened on land. And we've stripped out the maritime dimension completely to focus on the Continental Army. The Continental Army deserves our attention, but if that's the only place our attention lingers, we're missing half the story.
Hmm. And at one point you talked about how these people and these men are dying on these ships, and they took them out and they buried them on the Jersey Shore on the beach, and that early in the 20th century they rediscovered these bodies.
That's right. Yeah. So the mortality rates on the Jersey is so great that every morning guards yell down into the locked hole, locked decks below, "Bring up your dead, you scum," or something equivalent to that. And so there'll be a rowing party of prisoners that goes out every morning on a tiny little rowboat from the Jersey to the Brooklyn shore to bury the day's dead, and they bury them in sand on the Brooklyn shore. This is Wallabout Bay, by the way, near what is today Fort Greene Park. And so, because you're burying in sand, and the Brooklyn Bay is tidal because it's tied to the East River and the Atlantic Ocean. The tides keep washing away the topsoil sand, as it were, exposing the bones. And so people on the Jersey can see human remains just waving at them effectively from the nearby shore. And those bones keep washing up, and a big horde of them will be rediscovered in the early 20th century. 1911 is the date I have in my head. And that will finally force authorities in New York City to put up a proper monument to the Jersey and the POWs who are on it. And that monument, it's called the Martyrs Monument, now sits up on the hill in Fort Greene Park where it can't be washed away.
What an incredible story. And again, one completely overlooked in most narratives about the American Revolution. We mentioned such far-flung places as India. Tell our audience what in the world would have been happening there that the American patriots would have been interested in. What was going on there, and how was this connected to the American
So, yeah, the
Revolution?
American patriots were super interested and engaged in what was happening in India during the war. And I opened that chapter with the Patriots finally naming a little battleship in Philadelphia in the dockyards. And who do they choose to name it after? It's not George Washington. It's not Ben Franklin. It's Idar Ali is the guy they named their new ship after in Philly. And Idar Ali, for folks who don't know, is the Muslim ruler of the Kingdom of Mysore in southern India at the time. And he is allied with George Washington, because he's allied with France, and France is allied with George Washington, and they're all allied against the same enemy, which is Britain, during the American War. So George Washington's coalition stretches around the world to include this Indian prince, who is making it his personal mission to push the British East India Company back into the ocean. in India to displace British forces from British Madras and ideally from British Calcutta and British Bombay as well. The French are goading him on because, of course, the French are engaged in the struggle with George Washington against Britain around the world, and the French and the Kingdom of Mysore ally in with fearsome effectiveness against British interests in India. And all of this is front page news, not just in London or Paris, but in Boston and in Philadelphia. And patriots in Philadelphia correctly see that Idar Ali is their ally, their brother at arms. There's one of the leading patriots is a physician in Philly called Benjamin Rush. And Benjamin Rush says, Idar Ali is the toast of my table, suggesting that patriot global awareness that we're all involved in a globe-spanning struggle against a common enemy. So I narrate Idar's intentions, what's in it for him. I narrate how far he gets and what happens when he unexpectedly dies midway through the war and is replaced by his equally, I think, aggressive son, Tipu Sultan. Fascinating stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You also narrate the story of German soldiers who were here in large numbers, Hessians. But you also, before we talk about them, you also have a chapter on Irish soldiers, which again, most Americans don't think about the Irish. We know that the Irish immigrated here in the 19th century, but you have an entire chapter on their experience fighting for the British Army.
Yeah, the Irish, of course, are fascinating in the era of the American Revolution. There's two main ways to think about them, Stan, and I do both in the chapter. The first is to think about Irish migrants to colonial America and what side these Irish Americans chose when the war with Britain begins. Your listeners may not be surprised to learn that many Irish hated being under British control in Ireland and came to America to put a bit of distance between themselves and Britain. And so when the war begins, these Irish American colonists come out pretty strongly on the patriot side and will be the backbone of patriot forces in many places like Pennsylvania. For instance, Andrew Jackson's ancestors are good examples of a family like that, Irish Presbyterian migrants. But the other side of the story is the Irish people in Ireland itself. They remain under British control in Ireland, and they are swept, many of them are swept into British forces as the British Army tries to expand and recruit and level up and send as many bodies as it can to fight against George Washington's army. So there will be conflagrations in the American Revolution in which Irish American patriots are fighting, Irishmen from Ireland who find themselves in redcoat uniforms, right? So Irish on Irish, if you will. And there's a strong religious matrix here as well. Even though many Irish Catholics don't come to America until much later, the 19th century, as you pointed out, in Ireland itself, it's divided between Irish Catholics, who are the large majority population, and then different species of Irish Protestants who have more political power but are fewer in numbers. And I narrate those tensions. And then finally, I talk about what it means for the Patriots to win the war in America. What does that mean for the Irish people in Ireland? Is that a disaster? Is that the best news they've ever had? What is it going to mean for Irish people to seize on the example of American independence and compare their own situation under Britain's boot after the American War and say, well, if the Americans can do it, maybe we should give it a try. And we see some significant attempts to seek Irish independence, both during the war and afterward in 1798.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which was fascinating to me that the revolution opened doors for Irish patriots, if you will, to strike back against the British. And we'll come back to this. But one of the things you say, one of the consequences of losing these colonies across the world really was a tightening up of imperial administration, whether it was the British or the Spanish. And we can come back to this, but which again, something I had never really thought about as to why, for instance, what happened in Canada, what happens in India, what happens in places like Ireland. We mentioned the Germans and the Hessians, but you also tell the story of one of the most interesting, famous, and quite frankly, lovable characters in the American Revolution. And you know who I'm talking about. Baron von Steuben, our German friend. Prussian, I guess, really.
Yeah, I love Baron Steuben. I fell in love with him a bit. I've got a bit of a boy crush on Baron Steuben as a
Yes.
result of digging into his life. Steuben is one of the characters who does appear in the sort of mythological narratives of the American Revolution as the guy George Washington hires at the Valley Forge to level up the troops. And that basic outline is true, although everything else is much more interesting than the mythological version gives us. Like, who was Baron Steuben? Why was he looking for a job in Washington's army in the middle of the war if he's so talented as a Prussian drill master? Why is he unemployed at that particular time? I tell that fascinating story. Um, the work he does at Valley Forge, the work this European Prussian drill master does, is actually to Europeanize the Continental Army. And that confounds the mythological view that the Continental Army's great strength is how un-European it is, how it like hides behind trees and uses Indian tactics. That's mostly nonsense.
Hmm.
The Continental Army as a major fighting force wants to act and be seen to act as a European style army, but it doesn't know how because it has no experience. It's a brand new fighting force with different colonial companies and regiments doing their own thing, not playing from the same sort of hymn sheet, if you will. And so this European officer comes in and standardizes everything to a European standard, and he's part, by the way, of a wave of out of work European officers who come and join the American Patriot side and help to do that. Think of Marquis de Lafayette, Casimir Pulaski, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, and of course Steuben. And the results are pretty impressive. It's not that Baron von Steuben turns them into, zombie killing machines. That's not the goal or the outcome. But he does teach them resilience and stick-to-itiveness and the importance of, formation and discipline. And those lessons, I think, will carry through not just in any battles, but in all the hardships that happen between battles for the rest of this endless war. And Steuben's, personal life and ideological program are completely fascinating. And I walked away from the experience of putting Steuben back at the center of the story with just endless respect for this Prussian guy.
And he stayed here
And he stayed
after,
here and
yeah.
demonstrated his patriotism over and over again, became, like me, perhaps, a naturalized US citizen after the war and tried to assimilate into a culture that regarded any foreigner with a bit of suspicion, but he managed to find a way.
Hmm. Real quickly, because I want to ask you some other sort of 10,000 foot level questions about the American Revolution, the US 250, and some other things. But real quick, I did want to ask you about the British Caribbean. I know that the Americans at the time hoped that they, like the Canadians, would come in on their side. You make it very clear why that was not about to happen. That the Caribbean was a sort of a different entity into itself, and most Americans forget how extraordinarily valuable those, and really more so than the American colonies, were to the empire.
That's right. We have to remember that when the war begins in 1775, the era of Lexington and Concord, there are about 26 British colonies in North America and the Caribbean.
Hmm.
Only half secede from that empire and break away. The other half, maybe even the majority, stay. A list that includes all the Canadian colonies like Nova Scotia and also all the Caribbean colonies. Think of Jamaica and Barbados and many, many more. And why those colonies choose to stay, why they do not engage with the insurgency, is a fascinating question we should ask ourselves, right?
Hmm.
And scholars have done good work on this. And my chapter on the Caribbean draws on the work of Trevor Bernard and Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy and many other great scholars. And we're all pretty clear that it's the Caribbean colonists' dependence on slavery and sugar and British military protection and security for their vulnerable islands, that mean that independence is not an option for white planters in Jamaica. And at the same time, the American War of Independence becomes an opportunity for enslaved people in the Caribbean as well to use the chaos of the war to rise up and try to free themselves, which puts extra security burdens on white planters and security forces. So I narrate the war in the Caribbean, both before and after France and Spain get involved. But of course, when France and Spain get involved, the Caribbean becomes a very busy theater, right? All the three
Hmm.
greatest navies in the world all converge not on New York, not on Massachusetts, but on Jamaica, basically. So putting Jamaica at the center of the story.
Yeah, those three navies, of course, the French, the Spanish, and the British. And you have a chapter on the Spanish Empire and what's going on there. You cite the fall of Pensacola as being one of the most consequential events of the entire war. And again, you tell the story of Botany Bay in Australia in 1788 and how that's linked. I'll leave that to the readers to read for themselves because I want to ask you some other questions. You end your last chapters on peace negotiations and how basically the Americans disregarded their instructions to follow their French allies. Whatever they wanted to do is what the Americans should do. And to their credit, I think uh, Franklin and Adams and Jay, when they worked together, essentially did negotiate a separate peace with the British to their own advantage. When it was all over, talk about what the consequences were for everybody, for the Americans and for the British, when this was all said and done.
Yeah, I mean it's not always fair to talk about winners and losers in any peace treaty, but I'm going to do it anyway for the
Hmm.
purpose of this conversation. Some of the losers may surprise us. Some of the losers are France and Spain and the Netherlands. They do not walk away from the global peace settlement with much to show for being victorious alongside the Patriots in the war. They don't get much of the territory back that Britain's taken from them in the war. They don't expand their territories or recover territories lost a generation ago. Spain had hoped to join the war to get Gibraltar back. It does not. Jamaica remains in British hands, the diamond in King George's imperial crown. France doesn't get Canada back, for instance. What do they have to show for themselves? Really not much. The big winner is, of course, the United States in the treaty and in the war. That shouldn't surprise us. They're definitely the big winners. They get all sorts of favorable trading terms from Britain, including fishing rights off Canada, which is wild when you think about it. But also they get massively expanded borders as a result of that separate peace deal they make with Britain. Let's remind your listeners, Stan, that before the war, British America ends in the Appalachians. But the US will draw its western border out at the Mississippi as a direct result of the negotiations in Paris. That is a huge win. The US doubles, at the moment it's born, it doubles in size.
Hmm.
That's thanks to Ben Franklin and John Jay at the peace table in Paris. We would expect the great losers in the peace negotiations to be the British. And in one sense, that's true. They lose 13 colonies to the US and a couple of others here and there to other powers, and that is definitely a loss. There's no sugarcoating that. But they don't lose as badly as we in America assume they did. They are able to cobble together some very favorable trading agreements with their former American colonists, which is to say, trade resumes immediately between Britain and the United States, and all the problems of governing those 13 troublesome properties vanish, while Britain continues to get the benefit of their trade relationship. So that's a win for Britain in some regard. It gets 60,000 loyalist refugees who want to be relocated to other underpopulated parts of Britain's global empire and who will be willing to defend those other British colonies like Nova Scotia from US attack in the War of 1812 or anywhere else like that. So it shores up its control over Canada, over Jamaica, over India by such means. And by negotiating that separate deal with the US, Britain makes sure that its great rivals, France and Spain, don't get a realistic advantage over them in the long scheme of European geopolitics.
And the age of salutary neglect was over. right?
It definitely is. Yeah, Britain will tighten the reins of royal rule, as I said, over those other places to make sure they don't end up like the US, to make
And
sure there will be no Canadian Revolution.
yeah, and I want you to tell it really quickly the great story about the quote where a Frenchman is sort of needling his British counterpart about the fact that I think all the people who settle in those provinces to the west are not going to be British. They're going to be rivals.
Yeah, there's a moment in the Paris peace talks where the outline of the deal is known and people are jockeying to claim victory. And there's a French diplomat who says something along the lines of the following to a British diplomat. Well, okay, don't you see that all these former British colonists, they will one day build their own empire to rival yours? How's that going to make you feel, British buddy? And the British guy he's trying to belittle there says, aha, yes, they will. And they will all speak English, every one of them, suggesting that, the cultural power of a transatlantic special relationship may continue to pay dividends to Britain long after it's lost control of the colonies. And that's basically the story of the 19th century.
Absolutely. Yes. Um, Rick, what did you have to leave out in telling this story? I'm sure there were other things, other chapters you had in mind, or things you thought were worthy of this. Did you have to leave something else out?
Everything important is in the book, but yes, the Dutch don't get their own chapter. I instead scatter what I have to say about the Dutch across various chapters, including the
Hmm.
Caribbean chapter,
Hmm.
for instance. If I was going to add a chapter, which I expressly chose not to because I don't think it's as significant as everything else that is in the book, it might be on Russia. Russia is a peripheral character in the book, but Russia is definitely courted by both sides, by George Washington's side and by King George's side, to send its massive army to either help bail the Patriots out or help kick the Patriots, you know what.
Mm.
We talked briefly, Stan, about how King George will hire 30,000 German soldiers to go join British soldiers in North America. King George only does that because Empress Catherine of Russia says no when he asks her first. So I'd love to write more about that or about the League of Armed Neutrality that Empress Catherine leads later in the war, which is a highly opportunistic attempt to ally with other neutral parties to mop up all the lovely trading opportunities created by the war, the disruptions of the war. So Russia is a player and deserves a bit more attention, but maybe there's a future project there.
Hmm. Yeah. Two final questions for you. First, how is now the history of the American Revolution, especially this year, 2026, how is it received in Great Britain? Is it still not a big deal? Still not taught? Are you looked upon as some sort of a unicorn uh, who has gone far afield to study this weird thing?
It's definitely unusual for a British person to study American history or this period of American history, and British people are confused about that. There's probably a sense among some people, by no means all, that Britain is the center of the universe, and why would you study anything that doesn't put Britain at the center of the universe? Which is a bit like how Americans like to think America is the center of the universe all the time, and it turns out the rest of the world is just as interesting.
Hmm.
When I was growing up, as I said earlier on, I was not taught anything at all about the American Revolution, empire, colonialism. We jumped from studying the Tudors, think of Henry VIII, to World War II with nothing in between, nothing in between, like a giant void. I'm pleased to say that my British nephews who go to public school in East London, their curriculum these days is a bit more inclusive of American history. They study the transatlantic slave trade now, which is something I did not study in school,
Mm.
which of course has a strong American element. But then they also study the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s and Martin Luther King. That is still very choppy, episodic struggle, content to jump from the 1800s to 1968. Leaves a lot to be desired, but at least it's moving in the right direction.
And I hope they'll be reading Uncle Rick's book.
I hope so.
Um, what finally, Rick, what is your, as we are here in the midst of the US 250, what is your message about the US 250 and about this moment in the world? What is your hope will come out of all this when all is said and done?
Yeah, I'm going to leave maybe any explicit commentary about politics, off the table here. That's not why I'm here.
Hmm.
But I will say that, one thing I took away from this study of the history of the American Revolution as a global conflict was how explicitly globally engaged our founding fathers were. As I said to you earlier on, Stan, Adams and Franklin and Washington are trying to build a coalition of willing partners to achieve something extraordinary and great, and they know they can't go it alone. They know they just can't bulldoze through the world, hoping to get away with whatever they want. That they need help, they need partners, they need consensus. And so, the version of the American Revolution I see emerging from Patriot strategy to build a global coalition is that it wasn't America first, it wasn't America alone, it was America among there. And I think alliance building and the value of diplomacy is a positive lesson in any age. At any time. And then I'd also note that the coalition of actual human beings who fight on both sides is much more diverse, inclusive, cosmopolitan, multilingual, national, multi-ethnic, multicultural than we've previously perhaps understood. So maybe there's a lesson to be drawn there about what we can do when we get together rather than divide ourselves apart.
The book is entitled The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. It's published by Penguin Riverhead. It came out on November 4th of last year. The author is Richard Bell. Rick, thanks so much for coming on to talk about this. Continued good luck in all of your endeavors to teach us more about our past.
It's been my pleasure, Stan. Thanks so much.
My thanks to Rick Bell for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at penguinrandomhouse.com and on his website, richard-bell.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. If you're a fan of Today in Georgia History, and who isn't, check it out at the completely redesigned website at todayingeorgiahistory.org, and you can see it and hear it currently airing twice a day on TV and radio on Georgia Public Broadcasting. You can find this podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, which would be most helpful and appreciated. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow, subscribe, and share with a friend, and drop me a line at sdeaton@georgiahistory.com. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. You can also treat yourself to every podcast, every blog, and every video entitled Dispatches from Off the Beaten Path at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.